The first sign that Thanksgiving was going to turn ugly was not what my sister said. It was where she told me to sit. Everybody else had a real chair at the table. Matching plates. Folded napkins. The usual things my mother always cared about. My place had been moved to a folding chair near the kitchen door, half outside the table line, with a paper plate and plastic fork already set down like somebody planned it early. I stood there holding a bottle of wine and a pie, looking at that chair, and I remember thinking, if they prepared this part, what else already happened before I walked in? My name is Ethan Parker. I'm 37, and I work commercial insurance claims outside Columbus. Most of my days are paperwork, damage reports, bad estimates, people explaining why numbers changed after signatures were already done. It is not exciting work, but it teaches you one useful thing fast. Once money gets involved, memory gets flexible. Back then, I understood that at work better than I understood it at home. I got to my parents' house about 15 minutes before dinner. Same as most years. I had a bakery pie in one hand and a bottle of red wine in the other, because even after everything had felt strange the last few months, I still showed up the same way I always had. Linda, my mother, was in the kitchen, finishing gravy. Robert, my father, stood near the sink with a beer. My sister Madison was lining up, serving spoons beside the turkey like she was setting up for a photo. Nobody greeted me like normal. Not cold exactly, just flat. Then I saw the chair. At first I thought maybe somebody moved things around because extra family came. But no. Every seat at the main table had a name card. Mine sat on the folding chair, handwritten on the back of what looked like a grocery receipt. The paper plate was already there. Plastic fork. Plastic knife. Everybody else had the heavy white plates my mother only used on holidays. I looked at Madison. Where's my seat? She barely turned. You're right there. I looked again because it sounded stupid even hearing it. You moved me next to the kitchen. It's easier, she said. For who? She shrugged. You always get up anyway. Linda took the wine bottle out of my hand before I answered. Leave the good plates there, she said. Paper is fine. She said it while looking at the counter. Not me. No smile. No explanation. I set the pie down beside the stove. Robert opened the fridge. It looked inside, then shut it again without taking anything. Traffic bad? He asked. Not really. That was the whole exchange. No one explained the chair. No one acted embarrassed. Madison kept adjusting silverware, like nothing about it was strange. A minute later, my cousin Chloe came in from the living room with her phone in her hand. She looked at my chair first, then at Madison, then smiled in a way I did not like. She lifted her phone and filmed the table for a second. I heard her laugh quietly at something on her screen after she posted it. Brandon came in carrying ice for drinks. Madison's husband. He gave me a short nod, then looked at the chair too. He noticed it. I could tell he noticed it, but he kept moving and said nothing. That silence told me more than words would have. I pulled the folding chair out and sat down. One leg dragged across tile louder than I wanted. Nobody reacted. Dinner kept moving. Turkey in the center. Sweet potatoes near Linda. Stuffing beside Madison. When I reached toward the stuffing bowl, Madison pulled it first and passed it the other direction. Let it go around first, she said. Again. A flat voice. Like logistics. I looked down at the paper plate. Steam from the food had already softened one edge. That was when I felt the folder inside my bag near my foot. I had brought it because the last 3 months had been off. Short replies. Missed calls only when money came up. Madison blocking me after I told her no on that business loan she wanted me to co-sign. I had not planned to use it. I just brought it because something in me said not to come empty-handed. Across from me, Madison stood before anybody touched the turkey knife. She picked up her wine glass and looked around the table. "Before we eat," she said, "there's something we all agreed on." Nobody moved. And right there, before she even said the next line, I knew this was not something she came up with alone. Madison kept her glass in her hand and looked around the table once more before she spoke. "We talked about it," she said. "All of us. Nobody touched a fork. Nobody looked surprised. That part landed first. Not the words. The fact that nobody looked surprised. Then she looked straight at me. We voted. You're not family anymore." For a second, I honestly thought she expected somebody to laugh after she said it. Like this was some ugly holiday joke she wanted credit for. Instead, Chloe clapped. Just 2 quick claps. Then Uncle Darren lifted his glass from the far end and said, "Well, better late than never." Linda let out a short laugh and reached for cranberry sauce. Somebody had to say it. That hit harder than Madison's line. Maybe because my mother said it without even looking at me. Too catted. Robert stayed with his beer. He looked at the table. Not at me. Like if he kept his eyes low enough, he could stay outside it. I still had one hand near the plastic fork. The paper plate bent a little under my wrist. Madison sat down halfway, then stayed standing again like she wanted the height. "You've made everything heavy for years," she said. "Every dinner, every holiday, every conversation." I looked at her. By showing up, she ignored that. "You always keep score. You help once, then act like people owe you forever." "Once?" My voice came out lower than I expected. Madison shrugged. "You know what I mean." "No," I said. "Actually, I don't." That got her smile back. Small, controlled. The kind she used when she thought somebody else losing patience helped her. Linda passed gravy to Chloe and skipped my side of the table completely. No pause. No correction. Just moved past me. Chloe leaned toward her phone again and checked whatever she posted earlier. Brandon stayed quiet beside Madison, elbows near his plate, looking down more than up. He had not touched his food either. Madison kept going. "You said no one time, and suddenly you act like everybody betrayed you." That almost made me laugh because she said it like the last 3 months started in a vacuum. Like refusing her business loan happened in empty air. No mention of the calls before that. No mention of the messages. No mention of how often just this once had already happened before. She reached for stuffing again when I moved my hand toward it. She pulled the bowl away first and handed it to Brandon. "Pass it around." Small move. Clean enough that nobody could call it obvious unless they were already watching. By then, I was watching everything. The real plates. My paper plate. The folding chair half outside the line. My name card, written on scrap paper. All of it done before I arrived. Linda finally looked at me. "It's unanimous," she said. That word stayed there longer than the rest. Unanimous. Like they sat somewhere and counted hands. Like somebody wanted this to sound official. I let out a short breath through my nose. Not anger yet. More disbelief. "You actually rehearsed this." Madison tilted her head. "We wanted to be clear." Robert finally spoke. Still not looking at me. Probably for the best. That was all he gave. 4 words. No defense. No reason. Just enough to let Madison keep ownership of the room. For a second, I thought about standing up and leaving. That would have been easy. Walk out. Drive home. Let them eat turkey and feel clever. But then I looked at Chloe's phone again. At Madison's face. At Linda already reaching for the serving knife like they expected this part to be finished. And something in me slowed down instead. Because the truth was, I had felt the shape of this coming for a while. The silence after I refused the loan. My mother calling less. My father replying with 1 word. Madison posting things online about cutting toxic people off. I had not known tonight would look exactly like this. But I had still brought the folder. The bag sat near my foot. I bent down slowly and pulled it closer. Madison noticed first. "What are you doing?" I unzipped the bag. The folder came up heavy in one hand. Tabs visible from the side. Printed pages thick enough to hold shape. Transfers. Dates. Screenshots. 5 years of things nobody here thought I would ever line up in order. I set it in the middle of the table. The sound was short and solid against the wood. Nobody spoke. Madison looked down at it, then at me. "What is that?" I sat back in the folding chair and looked at her. "If I'm out," I said, "you probably don't need this anymore." Madison looked at the folder like she expected it to be some cheap stunt. For the first time that night, she did not speak right away. Linda leaned forward first. "Ethan, don't do this." I looked at her. "You already did." Madison reached out and pulled the folder closer with 2 fingers. Slow at first. Almost careful. Like she still thought whatever was inside could be laughed off if she opened it the right way. The tabs were visible from where I sat. Each one labeled by year. Each section clipped clean. Nothing dramatic. Just paper. She opened the first tab. The first page was a transfer confirmation. $2,000. Her name. 3 years ago. The note line still there. Car repair. Urgent. She looked at it once. Then flipped to the next page. Another transfer. Different date. Same account. Then another. The room stayed quiet because even people who did not understand numbers understood repetition. Brandon leaned slightly toward her. "What is that?" She did not answer. The next page had screenshots. Her messages. My number. Her words exactly as she sent them. "Will you make enough to help?" Below that, "It's just temporary." Then, what? "Joel doesn't need more stress right now." Her face changed a little there. Not panic yet. Just the first sign that this was not what she expected. She turned another page too fast, and one sheet slipped halfway loose. A Zelle history printout. 3 payments inside 1 month. Dental. Rent. School deposit. Each one highlighted. Linda tried to look over her shoulder. Madison moved the folder slightly away without thinking. That small move got Brandon's attention more than the papers did. He took the folder from her hand. Not rough. Just direct. "What is this?" Now he looked himself. First page. Second page. Third. His eyes slowed by the time he hit the screenshots. Linda sat back. "That doesn't prove anything." I stayed where I was. Folding chair. Plastic fork still near my hand. The turkey untouched in the middle. Brandon kept going. He reached the next section. That one had family texts. Linda asking for $1,200 because the heat bill was overdue. 2 days later, there was a restaurant receipt clipped behind it. Same weekend. Downtown steakhouse. Linda saw that page and looked down immediately. "We paid that back another way," she said. Nobody answered her. Brandon turned another page. Then stopped. That was the page I knew would hold him longer. Joint card statement. Hotel charge. Santa Monica. 3 nights. $4,200. His eyes stayed there. Then moved lower. Parking. Breakfast twice. Room service. He looked up at Madison. "What is this?" Madison crossed her arms. "That has nothing to do with him." He kept holding the page. "Our card." It was work. He flipped once more. The next page was the statement detail she had forwarded me herself months earlier when she wanted help paying that card because Brandon was already watching balances. The attached PDF still had everything. Check-in line. Room number. And one more name. Ava Mercer. Brandon read that name twice. Then looked at Madison again. "You told me Chicago." "It was a conference." "There's no conference on this." Linda pushed her chair back a little. "Maybe not here." Brandon did not even look at her. He looked at the page again, then lower. Another highlighted line. 2 breakfasts charged the same morning. He asked, without raising his voice, "Who's Ava?" Nobody answered. Chloe put her phone face down. Robert finally looked up from his beer. Madison looked at me instead. "You printed private statements. You sent them when you asked for money. That doesn't give you the right. You used it to explain why you needed help." Brandon turned the next page. That one had private comments printed from a thread Madison forgot I still had access to after she once logged into my laptop years back and never logged out properly. Her own words sat there, clean in black print. "He always pays if you wait long enough." Then lower. "Cash cow with no spine." Chloe saw that line and looked away first. Linda pressed one hand flat on the table. "Madison." Her voice sounded different now. Less certain. Madison reached for the page. Brandon kept it. He looked at her. "You wrote this." She did not answer. That answer did enough. He flipped again. The next section showed totals. 5 years, lined in order. Rehab payment. Veneers called emergency dental. College move-in costs. Mortgage gap. Trip labeled family emergency that turned into flight receipts. Every amount dated. Every request attached beside it. Robert finally spoke. "What exactly are you trying to prove?" I looked at him. That tonight didn't start tonight. Madison stood up so fast her chair hit behind her. "You kept records for years." "Yes. That's sick." "No." I said. "It's organized." Brandon still had the page in his hand. He looked at Madison again. This time, slower. "Who's Ava?" Madison stayed standing but still did not answer him. Brandon waited a few seconds. Page still in his hand. "I asked you." "It was work," she said again. This time her voice came lower. Tighter. Brandon looked back down at the statement. 3 nights. It was a conference. You said Chicago. It changed. He lifted the paper slightly. "This says Santa Monica." Linda pushed her chair back and looked between them. "Brandon, maybe put that away for now." He ignored her. The next page was already under his hand. That one had the email Madison sent me when she wanted help paying the card. Subject line: "Can you send this tonight?" Under that, her message: "Brandon thinks holiday stuff pushed the account lower. I'll explain later." The attached statement still showed the same hotel. Same room. Same dates. Same second name listed on check-in. Ava Mercer. Brandon read the page slowly this time. Then looked at Madison again. "You sent this to him." Madison looked at me instead. "You kept old emails. You asked me for money." I said, "I kept what came with it. That was private. You attached it." Brandon turned one more page. 2 Venmo transfers. Same month. One marked Ava Weekend. The other, "I'll cover next time." He stared at the names. Then, at Madison. "How long?" Madison let out one short laugh. "You're doing this here." He did not move. "How long?" Nobody touched anything on the table. The turkey sat in the middle untouched. The gravy had already cooled. Chloe had both hands near her phone now, but was not recording anymore. Robert finally put his beer down. Linda spoke first because nobody else did. "This has nothing to do with tonight." I looked at her. "It became tonight when you all stood me up as the problem." Madison turned toward me. "You added that because you wanted a bigger reaction." "No," I said. "It was already in the file. You knew he'd see it. You opened it." That shut her up for a second. Brandon kept reading. The next tab showed totals. 5 years in order. Transfers highlighted. Amounts listed by month. $8,000 for rehab. $2,300 for veneers, listed as emergency dental. $6,000 for Chloe's move-in costs. $12,000 for Linda's card debt. $4,500 for a family emergency. Behind that one was the Cabo booking receipt. Madison forgot used the same date she claimed crisis. Brandon looked at that page. Then at Linda. You knew he paid for Cabo. Linda folded both hands together. We were under pressure that year. No one answered her. Robert rubbed his mouth once and looked down again. Madison finally stepped closer to Brandon. Give me the folder. He kept it. No. Her jaw tightened. This is exactly what he does. He saves things. He waits. I stayed seated. Still near the kitchen. Still on the folding chair they picked for me. The paper plate in front of me had one streak of gravy on the edge and nothing else. Brandon lifted another page. This one had screenshots from a private comment thread. Madison's account. Her words. He always folds if you wait long enough. Then another line. He acts hurt every time like somebody forced him. Below that, cash cow with no spine. Linda saw that and looked straight at Madison. No defense this time. Just silence. Chloe looked down at her lap. Brandon asked, without looking away from the paper. You wrote all this too. Madison reached for the page again. He moved it back. Answer me. She crossed her arms. I vented. You told me he was unstable. You believed him before me. I'm reading what you wrote. That landed harder than anything louder would have. Robert looked at me now for the first full second, all night. What exactly did you want from this? I looked back at him. Nothing. I brought it because I knew if I came tonight, this room would try to tell the story one way. Linda shook her head. You could have talked. I did. Every time money came up, Madison gave a short laugh again. But there was no confidence left in it. So this was the plan. Sit there quiet for years and build some file. No. I said. The plan was dinner. Brandon lowered the folder a little. Then looked at Madison again. No anger in his face yet. Just something colder. Something that usually comes right before somebody stops, pretending they still need the answer softened. He asked again. This time, slower than before. Who is Ava? Madison looked at Brandon for a long second. Then at the folder. Then at me. She still did not answer. The silence felt different now, because nobody at the table was following her lead anymore. Before that, every line she said had somebody around her ready to support it. A laugh, a nod, a quick excuse. Now nobody moved first. Brandon kept holding the page. Just answer the question. Madison folded her arms tighter. It doesn't matter who Ava is right now. It matters if our card paid for 3 nights, and you told me you were in Chicago. Linda stood up halfway. This is getting out of hand. Brandon finally looked at her. It got out of hand before I opened this. That stopped her. Robert stayed seated but leaned forward enough to see the pages spread near the center of the table. His eyes moved over the totals. He had not really looked before. Now he did. The highlighted amounts sat there plain enough that nobody could pretend they were random. 5 years. Date after date. Request after request. Every payment clipped to the message that came before it. I reached forward and turned one section toward him. Page 3. I said. He looked down. That page had his surgery payment. $1,500. Back surgery, deposit. The text above it came from his phone. Need it by Friday. Don't mention this to your mother yet. Robert read it once and leaned back again. Linda saw that line too. That was different. I looked at her. How? You offered? No. I said. You asked? Another page sat open near her side. 12,000 over 4 payments. Her card debt. Each transfer tied to her messages. Minimum due is ugly this month. Please don't make me explain this to your father. Then, clipped behind it. The restaurant receipt Brandon already noticed earlier. Downtown Steakhouse. Same weekend. Linda pressed her lips together and looked away. Madison still stood there like she thought staying angry would keep her upright. I reached to the next section and slid one page toward Chloe. She looked at it before touching it. Her college move-in costs? $6,000. Truck rental. Dorm deposit. Books. The transfer line had her mother's message attached. She'll pay you back after graduation. Chloe looked up slowly. I didn't know that was you. No. I said. You weren't supposed to. She stayed quiet after that. No defense. No apology yet either. Just quiet. Brandon kept turning pages on his own now. He reached the Cabo section. 4,500, labeled family emergency. Behind it sat flight confirmations. Hotel booking. 2 rooms. Linda saw that page and tried first. That trip happened after. The transfer happened 2 days before departure. I said. Nobody argued because the dates were there. Madison looked at me again. You brought all this to humiliate people. No. I said. You handled humiliation before I opened my bag. That landed harder than anything louder would have. Robert looked at my plate for the first time. Paper plate. Plastic fork. His eyes moved to the folding chair. Then, to the main table. He finally understood at least part of how tonight looked from where I sat. Linda followed his eyes too. No one said anything about the chair. Nobody needed to. Brandon reached another screenshot. Madison's private comment thread. The same line sat there again. He always folds if you wait long enough. Below it. He hates conflict more than losing money. And then? He'll end it. He always does. Brandon read each line slowly, then looked at Madison. You said he made people feel guilty. He does. You called him for money last month. That's family. I let out a short breath. There it is. Madison turned toward me fast. Don't act like you were forced. You always said yes. Yes. I said, until I said no once. Linda spoke before Madison could. You could have just refused without making everything ugly. I did refuse without making anything ugly. I said, 3 months ago. That room stayed quiet again because everybody there knew that part was true. No shouting happened then. No scene. Just a no. And after that came silence. Distance. And tonight? Brandon closed one section and looked at the folder cover like he was trying to place how many things in his own house now sounded different. Robert finally spoke. You kept all of this. Yes. For years. Yes. Why? Because that answer mattered more now than before. I looked at him. Because every time money left my account, somebody later talked like it happened another way. Madison gave one short laugh. But there was nothing steady left in it. You really think paper changes anything? I looked at her. No. Paper just stops people from changing what they already said. Nobody answered me right away after that. Madison stayed standing. Brandon still had one hand on the folder. Linda sat down slowly. Both hands folded too tight in front of her. Robert looked older than he had an hour earlier. The table looked the same. But nobody treated it like dinner anymore. Brandon closed the page he was holding and looked at me. Is that everything? No. I said. Then I reached into my coat pocket. That got everybody's attention faster than anything else had, because by then they were all waiting for what else I brought. Madison gave a short breath through her nose. What now? I pulled out the second envelope and placed it beside the folder. Smaller than the folder. Plain white. Already sealed. Brandon looked at it first, but did not touch it. Linda looked at me. What is that? You should read it. I said. Brandon opened it because nobody else moved. Inside were copies. Signed forms. Stamped already. He read the first page. Then stopped halfway through. His eyes lifted. What is this? I answered before anyone else could. Power of attorney removed. Medical proxy removed. Emergency contact changed. Linda blinked twice. then leaned forward. No. Brandon looked down again and kept reading. There was another page behind it. Trust authority removal. My name gone. Robert straightened in his chair. You filed that 2 weeks ago. Linda looked at me like she expected that sentence to turn into something softer after a second. It did not. You actually filed this? Yes. Without talking to us. I looked at the folder still open between us. You voted me out before dinner. That was anger. She said quickly. This is legal. No. I said, this is finished. Madison stepped closer. You are being dramatic. I looked at her. No. I was quiet for years. This is paperwork. That shut her up for a second because paperwork was sitting right there in front of all of them, already doing more damage than shouting would have. Robert reached toward the envelope. Brandon handed him the top page. He read slower than Brandon had. One line at a time. Then looked at me. So, if something happens to your mother, you call whoever is listed now. Linda's face changed then. Not anger first. Something closer to panic. You can't do that. I already did. You were our backup. That line came out before she could stop it. Nobody missed it. Not even her. The second, she heard herself say it. She looked down. Backup. Not son. Not family. Backup. Madison looked at her mother. Then at me. You'd really leave them with nobody. I looked around the table. At the folding chair. At the paper plate still in front of me. At the chair they kept for themselves. At some point, I said, you all already decided I was extra. Nobody answered that. Brandon read the second page again. Trust paperwork too. Yes. Robert put his page down carefully. When did you even decide this? The week after, nobody answered my calls. Linda shook her head. We were upset. No. I said, you were adjusting to hearing no. Madison folded her arms again. But there was less force in it now. You always make yourself the victim. No. I said, I just stopped pretending this was normal. Brandon stayed quiet longer than before. Then he looked at Madison. You knew about this. No. You knew they depended on him this much. Madison said nothing. That answer did enough again. Robert rubbed one hand across his forehead. Linda finally looked at the papers and asked the question she probably should have asked first. Who's your emergency contact now? That almost made me laugh. But I did not. Not family. That landed harder than I expected, because nobody spoke after it. Not Madison. Not Linda. Not Robert. Not even Chloe. Brandon folded the pages back into the envelope slowly. Then set it beside the folder. 2 stacks on the table now. 5 years in one pile. The future in another. Madison tried once more. So what? You walk out and that's it. I looked at her. Yes. Linda's voice came softer now. We made mistakes. I stood up. The folding chair legs scraped louder than before. You did more than that. Robert finally looked straight at me. You're serious? Yes. And for the first time all night, nobody at that table looked like they still believed they could talk me smaller again. I picked up my bag first. Then my coat. Nobody tried to stop me right away. That surprised me more than anything else, because for years somebody always had one more sentence ready when money or guilt started slipping away. That night, nobody found one fast enough. Linda stood halfway but did not come around the table. Robert stayed seated with one hand still near the envelope. Madison looked like she wanted another line. Something sharp enough to pull control back. But nothing came out. Brandon stayed where he was. Eyes on the folder. The only sound near me was the folding chair, moving back into place when I stepped away from it. I looked once at the table before leaving. Real plates. Half-cut rolls. Steam gone from the food. My paper plate still almost empty near the kitchen side. No one touched the turkey yet. That part stayed with me longer than I expected. All that planning, all that setup, and nobody even reached dinner. Linda finally spoke when I got near the front hall. "You're really leaving?" I put my coat on. "Yes. We can talk tomorrow. We could have talked 3 months ago. That was different." "No," I said. "It just cost less back then." Madison came after that. Not close enough to block the door. Just enough so I could hear the anger again. "You think this makes you right?" I picked up my keys. "No. It just makes me finished." She gave one short laugh. "You always do this. Quiet until you want people to feel bad." I looked at her one last time. "You moved my chair before I even got here." That shut her up because there was nothing clever to do with the truth once it was simple enough. Robert finally stood. But he still stayed behind the dining room line. His voice came lower than before. "You don't have to make one night permanent." I opened the front door. This wasn't one night. Cold air came in right away. Nobody followed me outside. That part mattered too. I walked to my car carrying the same bag I came with. Except now the folder was gone and the second envelope was on their table. The driveway lights were still on. I sat behind the wheel but did not start the engine right away. I could still see the dining room through the side window. Nobody sat back down immediately. Everybody stayed standing in different places, looking at paper instead of each other. I drove without music. About 15 minutes later, I pulled over near the lake outside town. The same place my father used to take me fishing when I was a kid. I stayed there maybe half an hour. No calls yet. No messages. Just cold air and water I could barely see in the dark. The first voicemail came the next morning. "Linda." Soft voice. Asking if I really meant it. No apology. Just asking if I meant it. Then, Madison. 3 texts in a row. First one said, "I embarrassed everybody." Second said Brandon was acting insane. Third said I had no idea what damage I caused. I read all 3 and put the phone face down. By the 3rd day, Brandon sent one message. Short. "Everything checked out." Then another one 10 minutes later. "I filed this morning." Nothing else. No details. He did not need details. A week later, Chloe texted too. She said she did not know I paid her move-in costs. Said she felt stupid for clapping. I read that one twice. Still did not answer. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving. Robert called from a number I almost did not pick up. He asked if I still had the number for the heating company because the payment arrangement had expired and he could not find the paperwork. I gave him the number. Nothing more. By Christmas, Linda sent a photo of their living room. Tree up. Stockings hanging. The hook where mine usually went was empty. Under the picture, she wrote, "It doesn't feel right without you here." No apology again. The next day, Madison tried once more. First, she said, "Ellie missed me." 2 minutes later, she added that mortgage calls had started and Dad was stressed. That part sounded familiar. Warm opening. Money hidden near the end. I blocked her number after that. In February, a letter came. 3 pages. Linda's handwriting. First page, regret. Second page, guilt. Third page, asking if I could help because they were behind again and the house might need to be sold. I read all 3 pages in my kitchen. Folded them once. Dropped them in the trash. 3 weeks later, Chloe sent one more message. Just a picture. A real estate sign in the front yard. The same house. Same porch. Same front window where Christmas lights used to hang. Behind the glass, I could see the dining room. The big table was gone. Under the photo she wrote, "Brandon took half the furniture. Madison's back in the guest room. Mom says they should have listened sooner." That was the first time anybody in that house said anything close to the truth. And even then, it came through somebody else. A month later, I moved for a new job. Different city. Better apartment. Quiet weekends. No late-night messages asking me to cover something urgent that somehow always became optional spending later. The strange part was how normal life felt once nobody had access to me. Coffee stayed hot because nobody interrupted it. Mornings stayed simple. Phone stayed quiet, and that quiet never felt lonely the way they always said it would. It just felt clean. So now I'm asking you the same thing people asked me after I posted about it. If your own family treated you like backup until you stopped paying, would you have walked out too? If you've been through something close to this, share it in the comments. I read more of them than you'd think. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe to Quiet Family Justice